Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read. It is nonfiction, which is always, out of the norm for what I usually read. And it's also a book club read that my friend Bevan is running. Usually those books have been pretty good, but spoilers, this book is unfortunately not very good. And I'll get to that more in the analysis section. But this book is about American racism, white supremacy, and wellness culture. I am referring to American Detox by Kerri, and that was published in 2022. For those who don't know, Kerri is a writer, I say in quotes, because I think this is the only thing that she's gotten published. And she's also a yoga instructor, and she's done sales work in the past. Don't know too much else about her besides what I can find on her website. But she seems to have been pretty invested in talking about white supremacy and racism and in doing social justice work. So I guess that's what's important. But without further ado, let's talk about American Detox. I'll do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. American Detox doesn't really have a story per se about it. Kerri does talk a little bit about her own life, but she mainly focuses on busting myths and talking about the racism and the faults of the wellness and healthcare industry. Specifically, she talks about her experience in 9/11 and how some people who were close to her died, and how the United States changed sometimes, often for the worse in the wake after 9/11. And she became more aware of the colonization and imperialism of the United States. And also came to realize that the promised American dream was not going to be delivered to many Americans. She talks about the failure of the healthcare industry, in particular with how it's not really focused on preventing illness, it's more focused on treating it when it gets there. The main difference between it being that if you prevent illness, you don't have to worry about it becoming a bigger problem later on. And she also talks about how a lot of the healthcare system is rooted in the eugenics movement, with healthcare professionals often determining who gets to reproduce and who doesn't. And she also talks about the idea of true healing, which is something like being comfortable with yourself and being understanding that trauma happens to a lot of people. It mainly pertains to mental health stuff, because the healthcare industry would have you believe that you need to be medicated or something like that, even for the smallest of mental illnesses. And sometimes that's not always how it works. She goes into a little bit of detail, so you think you have to read it to truly understand what she's talking about there. And she goes into the myths of the wellness industry, talking about yoga and how the wellness industry tries to sell you a cure for everything, even if what's going on for you isn't necessarily what's wrong. It's based on the differences between normal and what is abnormal, with certain people depicted as the norm and other people depicted as not really the norm. And also goes into a little cultural appropriation with yoga as well, as when she's talking about that. And she talks about how people who are poor, like those in poverty, are often excluded from talks of wellness. And it's often the case that people who are poor, it's viewed as their fault, their problem if they can't get well. There's some sort of deficiency on them if they're poor. Whereas, as Kelly would argue, that it's not really the problem that they're poor; it's that the government has failed them, and it would be important to give them access to money and provide a better social safety net. She also talks about perfectionism and how the capitalist society can exacerbate the desire to be perfect, because if you're not, you're going to feel bad, and that's going to lead to further mental health problems down the road. She talks about fat phobia and thin privilege. and how the healthcare industry often tries to tell people that if you're fat, that means you're unhealthy. But it's not always the case. There are different people of differing body sizes, and you could work out and be perfectly healthy and still be fat due to whatever might be going on with your body. And so that's not necessarily a reflection of health, but the healthcare industry has sort of internalized that message. And then she also goes on to talk about mutual aid and community support and those kinds of ideas, as well as talking about the self-help industry and how it often devolves into sort of talks about individualism and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And so much like with perfectionism, if you can't be the very best, if you're not the best that you are, then you're viewed as weak, or you can't really engage in any self-help, which again produces more negative mental health effects down the road. And she makes an argument that rather than focusing on individualism, we should be more collectivist and focus on the value of the community, because then we can get out of the isolationist kind of feel and be around other people and build up that support and that mutual aid that she was talking about. She also talks about like how whiteness is rooted in America, as well as the wellness industry, and how there's white privilege, and that's an important factor into all of this. Talking about separation and how the capitalist society often strives to keep people separated, because if they're together, they're going to realize that their true enemy is the upper class rather than among races. And also just it helps prevent union power from developing if you keep people separated. And she also talks about the terror that is apathy, where if you're not actively participating in your community, if you let those in power convince you that participating is not helpful at all, and you become apathetic, it's going to allow this culture to thrive, and you need to participate, or else that's exactly what happens. And then she ends the story by having a conversation with some other people, some of her close friends and colleagues, and that's really where the story is. I'm not going to discuss that even further than I need to. That's about where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, Kerri Kelly does talk about a number of interesting ideas in this book. One of them is the idea of normality, or the sort of center focus on when it comes to the wellness industry and the focus of the United States at large. And what Kerri Kelly is arguing here is that normality is a concept created by both the wellness industry, the healthcare industry, and white supremacy. It's created by the wellness industry as an effort to sort of sell you on something, because if there's an idea of normal, then people will strive to be normal, and you can convince them to buy your cures, your products, whatever you want, in order for them to be normal and not be considered the outlier. And for white supremacy, that comes into play because for in the healthcare industry and many other industries, the white people are often center focused and are viewed as the norm. So if something is a problem for white people, as Kelly notes in this book, that it's a problem for everyone. There's a public health crisis and we got to work on that. But if there's a problem for people of color, that's not seen as normal or essential or something that needs to be worked on. That's something that can be dealt with later, or preferably not at all for more conservative politicians. It's like we can't be spending money if it only affects a small subset of the population. And then meanwhile they're just arguing that if white people are affected, then we have to absolutely do something about it. And so what this ends up doing is it creates a one size fits all kind of method, where if you're constantly comparing and contrasting people against the standard of whiteness, against the standard of what is and isn't normal. And if you're not in that norm, if you're outside the norm, then you're out of luck. Like, the wellness industry doesn't want to deal with you, or they want to sell you something to make sure that you are normal. And society at large, American society at large, because they bought into this, they're gonna view you with suspicion, because why aren't you fitting into this norm? And I really like that message that Kelly is trying to get across, that there is no such thing as normal. And no matter how much the wellness industry tries to create this message of normal, we have to do our best to reject these standards. Indeed, Change only comes when you reject the standards that are created, these false standards that are created by the white supremacist sort of system. Like the wellness industry might not realize that they're passing on a sort of white supremacist kind of message in that regard, but you still have to work to change it and make sure that everyone is included, that all perspectives are heard. Otherwise, you're just enforcing these weird, unhelpful standards upon the massive population, and over time that can create a lot of public health problems. Kelly also talks about the current failures of the system at large. She talks about the failures of the healthcare system related to it being built up through the eugenics system, how a lot of people don't have access to healthcare, and when they do, it's often more costly for mental health care, or even care on like vision or dental. And also, again, basing everything upon the white supremacist system there. Education is not easily accessible, especially as it pertains to wellness. And those in poverty are often struggling to get the health care that they need. They're struggling to get access to wellness kind of policies, be it whatever you need money to get access to. And so Kelly's really noting that the system as a whole has failed pretty much everyone. Whether it be those who are poor or even those who have money, because they're still being beholden to a white supremacist system that might not give them what they need. It'll give them what's seen as normal, and maybe that's not what's best for them. Again, fitting them into a sort of one-size-fits-all kind of policy. And what I think Kelly's arguing here is that to fix this, we need to be more politically active, and we need to be more politically active, because if that apathy is gonna get at us. Like if we're not politically active, then we're just allowing this to happen, and nobody's really trying to stop it or counter that message at all. And that can entail like voting or petitioning politicians, or speaking out loud and proud. Although Kelly also argues that sometimes working within the system doesn't always fix the problems. And I do think that's the case, that voting can help, but as Audre Lorde would say, the master's tools aren't going to be enough to bring down the master himself. So something to consider there. But also she suggests that we should rely on others. Kelly argues for mutual aid and just general collectivism, community organization in order to counter these messages. Because only through working with the community are we going to be able to change and move away from the stuff that doesn't work now. If we rely on the government to do it, like, it's not going to get fixed. As is so often the message, nobody is coming to save us. We're going to have to do this ourselves. And I think that's a very important message to hear. Like, we're going to have to work together. It's not going to be easy. And if we wait on other people, then it's going to take forever for this to ever get fixed. Kelly also talks about the ideas of individualism versus collectivism, this sort of I versus we mentality. Whereas with individualism, it's focusing on the individual and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and going off into the world. Collectivism focuses on the need to rely on others, and even brings in like the idea of self-determination, which I think is very important. It's certainly a phrase I've been hearing a lot more lately. Whereas like the idea of independence is you can do this on your own, you don't need any help, and if you do, that means that you're weak. Self-determination is you can do this on your own, and if you can't, we will provide you with the tools and skills you need to thrive. So self-determination is more of a collectivist idea, because it recognizes that human beings are social creatures. They rely on others, and we don't live in a perfect world where everything gets done right away. And I think that's important. I think we do need to move to a more self-determination type of culture that builds heavily upon collectivism. It's the only way that we're going to solve public health crises like COVID or monkeypox, and it's the only way that we're going to switch to actually caring about people rather than this sort of callous and independent individualistic culture that seems to be rotting every aspect of the United States. And I definitely agree with Kelly's message here. However, despite these quality elements that I think she largely borrows from other people's writings, including some of the stuff that I've read before from Ibram X. Kendi or from Heather McGhee in The Sum of Us, or a number of other books that Bevan has actually suggested I read, I feel like one of the big problems is that this is unfocused. It feels like she's trying to talk about multiple ideas here and there and everywhere, and I don't think it really works. I think it makes this a lot of what she's saying vague, and she could have focused on a couple of ideas, but instead she tries to make each chapter like an all-encompassing aspect of everything. Almost like she read a Wikipedia page about racism and was like, I have to include all of this. And, you know, it's very admirable that she would try to talk about so much, but given that she's focused on the wellness industry, you think she would keep it limited there. Like it's possible to talk about both the racism that exists in the United States and the wellness industry. I'm doing it in this video right now, and keep it focused on that rather than moving to a bunch of tangents that don't quite create a cohesive narrative for what you're writing about. And another problem related to this is that it seems like Kelly believes that this is a radical sort of book. Like this is a book that is challenging to the system and confrontational and might be even controversial. But I don't think it's as radical as she believes. I think one of the biggest problems with this is that it's really just building off of what a lot of people have already said, and it doesn't in any way force people to look at their governments and say this is a problem. Rather, it forces them to look at their individual communities, and that's great. Like telling people to go into mutual aid and rely on each other and build up their communities is strong, but it doesn't challenge the status quo in any meaningful way. And I don't think the book behind this would allow it to have been published if it was going to be as challenging as they think it is. Or not the book, but the publishing company. Like, I don't think they'd allow it to get published if it was gonna, like, uproot society in any meaningful way. So, and I feel like that's a problem, because if someone says my book is challenging or anything like that, at least I hope they'd be honest about that, or maybe don't tell me, like, let me say that about your book. It's a small problem that I have with this story. Like, I don't like being told by the author that their book is going to change the world. I would rather see that it changes the world and then have a discussion about that afterwards. And then kind of related to all of that is how she is just seemingly parroting existing ideas, referencing authors who are already there. And so for me, the story seems really a collection of commentary on the stuff that other people have written. I don't really know what Kerri Kelly is bringing to this project, besides some commentary on what happened for her during 9/11. That's not necessarily a giant problem for any of her writing, but it is kind of weird that it would be so focused on what other people have said. And I don't want to bring up that, you know, that she's a white woman writing all of this, kind of leaning heavily on the writings of Black individuals. But if we're going to be talking about the wellness industry and ideas about yoga and whatnot, I'd at least like to hear some Asian, hear from an Asian writer rather than someone who is maybe culturally appropriating her proficiency in yoga. I don't want to go too in depth into this, because that'll be another discussion entirely. But I don't know too much about this writer, and so for her to just be another white woman writing about her slow journey and discovery about how America is racist, it's like, we already knew this. Why are you telling us this now? Like, and you're not even telling us anything new about this. You're not presenting new ideas. You're just relying on what people have already said. And so I feel like that's a giant problem at the base of this story as well. Anyway, those are my somewhat incoherent thoughts on American Detox by Kerri Kelly. Unfortunately, it is a stinker, and it's one of the worst books that Bevan has recommended for the book club. Not necessarily an awful book or anything like that, but one that I feel doesn't bring a lot to the discussion when it comes to social justice and the path forward. Like, she presents a number of good ideas, but I don't think it's enough to sustain this entire book, and it just feels a little bit unfocused, and it could have used a little bit more work, possibly different voices being added to it. Anyways, if you read this before, or you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about American Detox. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book and this author if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and collectivist travels. Farewell.